So this panel will be setting the scene. I'm very, very excited to be introducing the chair introducing the chair up to the stage. So Derek Bardowell, if you've not heard of him, you absolutely should have. Social commentator, book author, absolutely. Read his books if you haven't yet. He's the CEO of 10 Years' Time, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to have him with us today. So Derek, if you could come up, thank you.
Welcome everyone. Something Jessie said and also Steph said has just really resonated with me. Yesterday, very local to me, a couple of young black males were coming home from school, and because one of them didn't have their travel card, they were absconded by I think it was 4 staff at a national rail station, and the police arrived and they put their hands around the neck of one of the young people who was 12 years of age for not having his bus pass. And the thing that really struck me and sort of brings me on stage with quite a heavy heart when we're thinking about what the future looks like is the fact that for all of the problems and woes that we have in our society, when I was giving my son the kind of talk about what he needs to be wary of when he walks out in the street, the first thing that I spoke to him about was the police. It wasn't anything else. It was about how you manage yourself dealing with the police. And the fact that that was something that I experienced from a very young age, that politicized me from a very young age, and that 40 years on, we're still going through that, that just sits on my heart in terms of one of the things that I want to see erased as we move into the future. And I go back to a recent panel that I was on, and there was this wonderful guy on this panel called Joe Nelson from Sealaska. And he said that the way that he envisages the work that he does, he puts together kind of 100-year strategies. Which doesn't mean that he doesn't act with urgency in terms of the work that he does, but he looks at things through the lens of what happens in 100 years and what that mountaintop looks like. When you speak about the great visionaries and some of the things that have happened in our lives, a lot of that has been through a vision of what change looks like. So I really welcome what we've seen and what we're hearing today, because it is about acting urgently, but it is also about moving forward and having a vision. We know that poor communities across the globe have a relationship with crisis and disaster more so than us in the UK. And that's often because of the geopolitical North's obsession with possession. We have the luxury here of thinking about things through a lens of lifestyle, where the communities in England, but across the globe, have to look at things through the lens of life and death. COVID should have brought us a bit closer to being able to understand what life and death looks like for all of us. Unfortunately, what I am seeing is people starting to fall back to their old normal ways, and we cannot afford to do that. Philanthropy won't save us. That is not the savior for any of us in terms of what this will look like. And history will not be kind to those who are complicit by their ignorance or by erasure. But the way in which we redefine the role of capital, our relationship to it, the responsibilities that we hold, the way we redistribute wealth, and the power and support that we need to give to communities to determine their own destinies is absolutely crucial. And I go back to the wonderful Yvonne Field, who's the founder of the Ubele Initiative. And she said when she was part of the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s, there were some key principles that lied underneath that work. And she said some of that was around communities taking the lead, sacrifice, laughter, joy, and belief. So today is about a tangible call for everyone in the room to start giving back, to invest in a very different way, to start looking at ways in which we contribute to redistributing wealth, and to act with urgency, but also with a 100-year vision. I'm excited to host the first panel. So if I could introduce the speakers to come up on the stage. So Gary Stevenson, Round of applause, please. Jesse Williams. Bridget Kustin. And Arun Advani. So we have heard from Stephanie, Jesse, and Bridget. So I'm inviting Arun Advani to come on stage and who's an associate professor at the Economics department at the University of Warwick, and to give us a few words about his vision around this wealth.
So I'm that exciting person here to talk about tax, as Stephanie so kindly set out. And the nice thing, actually, it doesn't make you the exciting person at a party to say you're a professor who studies tax. But I'm in a room full of people who spend a lot of time thinking about tax. So actually, this is kind of the home crowd. So I thought I'd start with a story. It's a story about the importance, the history of tax. I mean, there's obviously lots to say about the history of tax, but I'll tell you a bit about power. I'll talk to you a bit about society, and I'll talk to you a bit about who pay taxes now. But I wanted to start with this point about history, because I think for me it was a really interesting story when I first heard it, and you'll forget everything else I say, but this is the bit you'll remember. So the Rosetta Stone is a thing we all know as a cultural icon. It's just this object that exists, this giant great stone carved in 3 different languages. It was used to be able to go back through time and work out actually how do you decode some of these languages, because the same thing was written out 3 times. The interesting thing about the Rosetta Stone is it's an object about tax. That's what it is. It's a document that sets out who pays tax. And actually, more specifically, it's a document that sets out who doesn't pay tax. It is a document about tax exemptions. It was created, it was one of a number of stones that were created and put into temples that were there to say who has to pay tax and who doesn't have to pay tax. And I think the 2 interesting lessons for me about it are, 1, it shows you how important tax was, that they got a flipping great stone and carved in 3 different languages so everybody would understand who has to pay tax. And the other thing is that what it said was that the priests didn't have to pay tax, and the people who worked in the temple didn't have to pay tax. And so this was their document that they could have so that when the tax collector came in, they could say, no, it says here, we're not paying tax. And it's interesting because the priests weren't the poor people, right? The priests weren't the people who were struggling. The priests weren't the people who were on the farms hoping that the floods would come and they would be able to therefore grow a great harvest. They were the people who everyone already paid a tribute to. They were the people who already got the fees. They already had the power in society. But they had argued for a tax exemption that said, look, we are doing good things. We are doing other things that are important in society. We're the kind of people you can't live without. We are the creators of wealth because we are here to pray for the floods. We're here to do the things that we do. And so we shouldn't have to pay tax. And so it's a document not only about how important tax was, that they had to carve it on this big stone, but it's a document about who they required to pay tax and who had the ear of the important people that they could not have to pay tax. So tax is now and has always been about power. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is what is tax for? Because tax in a lot of the communities that some of you will represent is a bit of a dirty word. It's that thing where it has to happen. We know it's there, but we kind of want to minimize what it is, and we work out, well, the rules say this is what the tax is actually due, and so we don't have to pay that then. We don't have to do this bit. If we structure things in this way, that's not covered. But tax, fundamentally, is how we pay for society. It's how we pay for lots of the important things in all of our lives. It's how, the classic things are the roads, but at a time now, I think it's just particularly fitting at the moment when, people are literally dying because they're freezing, because, we've made this room cold so you know what it feels like. People are literally going to freeze to death over the winter, and it's because they can't afford to heat their homes. It's because they can't afford, and these are not, again, there'll be people who are, for example, older and they're living off their pension, but there are people who are in work, who are the key workers, the people that 2 years ago we were all clapping because they are the nurses in the hospitals. They are the people who drive the trucks that get our food to our supermarkets. There are those people who are, the reason they're on strike is not because they're asking for massive pay increases that are going to make them better off than they were before. They're saying inflation is 11%, and we haven't had a pay rise in quite a while, and could we just have maybe half of inflation for now so we're not completely screwed? And the argument is, no, we can't afford that. We couldn't afford £20 a week for people who are on universal credit during the pandemic, because that would cost us £6 billion. £6 billion is like 0.5% wealth tax on the bit of wealth you have that's more than £10 million. If you were to tax that at 0.5%, you'd have been able to cover that. And that meant so much, people were fighting for it because for most people, like £20 a week is a lot of money. That was really a big difference to them. And we said we couldn't afford it. It's just too expensive. We can't afford that, sorry. And so that's where I wanted to talk about, who does pay taxes and who doesn't pay taxes. I mean, the current structure of the tax system is one in which we tax people who are doing things that it's hard to do anything else. If you're an employee, you're going to work, working your kind of basic, minimum wage job, you can be forced to pay income tax, you can pay national insurance on top of that, and that is, you've got nothing you can really do to kind of reduce your tax bill. You don't have any structure which you can use that's going to reduce things. I think one of the ones that really sort of strikes me as a tax that shows you how much tax doesn't work, and this is one that you all know. I mean, you all know this doesn't work, but it's funny because the rest of the world doesn't. This is the group that knows it doesn't work. Is inheritance tax. People point to inheritance tax and complain and say, oh, it's so high, it's 40%. Which one of you are either going to pay or have a client that's paid 40% inheritance tax? Nobody pays 40% inheritance tax. What you see is that, and there's a government report that shows, the inheritance tax is obviously, it's a public policy document. There's a government report that shows, well, what does it look like in the UK? Inheritance tax, you don't pay it up until about £1 million for a couple. It then goes up. You see the average rate rises to almost 20% for people who have, as a household, wealth of £2 million. And then you see the rate drops. It doesn't even flatten out, it drops. You should think, if people were paying 40%, it would be going up till eventually people are paying 40%. The fact there's an allowance at the bottom is why it's not 40% straight away. What you see is it drops. It's about 10% at £10 million, and that's not including the fact that some money's in trust, and so it's not even observed in the data. And that's because, as many of you will know, there are so many things that you can do to get around those kind of taxes. Because people who have the ear of HMRC, who have the ear of politicians, can say, oh, well, it would be really good to have a tax break for this. It's really important to have that. It's really this, that, and the other. And at the end of all of those things, what you end up is the modern Rosetta Stone. You end up with a document that says, for the people who actually aren't the ones who really need the tax breaks, we found a way in which we're not actually going to make them have to pay that much tax. And so the final thing I'll say is, I'll talk about wealth tax. So a couple of years ago, I ran the Wealth Tax Commission. I actually didn't know at the time what I thought about wealth taxes. It literally started because one sunny morning while I was in my garden in the middle of early in the pandemic in April, I got a phone call on the same morning from 2 different journalists who said, it looks like government debt's going quite high. Should we be having a wealth tax to pay for it? And I'm a tax professor. As far as these things go, a bit of an expert in tax and wealthy people. And I said, I don't know. I think we haven't really looked into that for quite a long time. It's not really on the table. No one's talking about it. And so we set up the Wealth Tax Commission to study it. It started off as a little project that I did with one of my co-authors that was going to be a few weeks of our time because we didn't really understand how long the pandemic would be or how big a question we were asking. And at the end of 6 months, we had 51 contributors, 500,000 words of evidence, 38 papers going through what we've seen around the world, through history, through all of the different aspects of it, the legal parts, all of the details you need to think about a wealth tax. And at the end, we said 3 things, and this is what I'll leave you with. The first was, current taxes on wealth in this country are broken. We need to fix them. Capital gains tax doesn't work very effectively. National insurance is paid by employees, but it's not paid by landlords and people who get money from dividends. Inheritance tax we just talked about. So current taxes on wealth are broken. You should fix those first before you think about a wealth tax, starting at some kind of 100,000, 500,000, the kind of numbers you would see in Switzerland or Norway when people point to wealth taxes. The second was about one-off wealth taxes, specifically in the context of the pandemic, and the fact that they were possible and could raise a lot of money. But the third thing, and the one that no one then has seemed to cover ever since then, the third thing we said was, even if you were to do the first thing we said, which is to fix all those other taxes we have on wealth, that would be great. You raise a load of money. You're not going to get that money from the wealthiest people. We know those things aren't going to matter for the wealthiest people, even if you fix those things. And that if you care about wealth inequality, if you think wealth inequality is important, and at this point I'm going to hand over to Gary to tell you about wealth inequality, but if you think wealth inequality is important, your only option is to have an annual wealth tax. And that annual wealth tax can actually raise substantial amounts of money. And you can raise it, if you raise it at a threshold of say, £10 million, there's actually only 22,000 people in the country who are going to pay it, which is not a lot of people. But they'll pay, about £11 billion at a 1% tax rate, which is as much money as you would raise from taxing everyone in the country by increasing that basic rate of income tax that they're paying. That's going to really hurt them by 1.5p. So for ordinary people, that 1.5p would be huge. It would be massive. They really couldn't, they wouldn't be able to survive that increase. You could also instead do a 1% tax. That's the difference in what you'd be able to do. But you'd raise a lot of money from doing it. It's also the only way in which you can deal with wealth inequality. And at that point, I hand over to Gary.
I'll just do a quick intro. Gary Stevenson, a former trader, and has been advocating in recent years for a wealth tax. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Right, so nowadays I'm an inequality economist, but I want to talk about how I got into that because I didn't always want to be an inequality economist. So I grew up in East London, like our keynote speaker, and I was from quite a poor family. And when I was a kid, basically, I wanted to be, well, not poor anymore. I wanted to be rich. I could see the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf going up when I was a kid, and I thought, when I grow up, I'll work on one of them skyscrapers and I'll be a millionaire. And that's what I did, basically. I did what you're supposed to do. I worked hard. I got into the London School of Economics. When I was at the London School of Economics, I entered a competition run by Citibank, which was a card game, actually. They used to use this card game to hire one trader a year. And in 2006, I won that competition, which meant that in June of 2008, I got a job as an interest rates trader for Citibank. 2008, you'll probably recognize, that's the year of the financial crisis. So my job when I was there was to bet, basically, on what will happen to interest rates in the future. In 2008, because of the crisis, all the interest rates in the whole world collapsed to zero. That meant that the job became very quickly betting on when will interest rates come back up. The history of that is actually really interesting. Right? So in 2008, all the economists, all the traders, all the central bankers thought their rates would go up in 2009, and they didn't. In 2009, everybody said 2010, and they didn't. In 2010, they said 2011. In 2011, they said 2012. That happened every year, actually, up until 2020, when everybody agreed that rates will stay zero forever. And safe to say that we're not very good at this, right? And my job was to bet on these things, right? And after about 2.5 years of seeing these guys be wrong consistently for 2.5 years, to be honest, I had pound signs in my eyes. I was thinking, look, if these guys can't figure it out, why can't I figure it out? So I decided to think a lot about why is it that rates got stuck at zero. So the theory is basically that if you cut rates really aggressively, you should get people spending. But that didn't happen. So after I quit that job, I actually came to study here at Oxford, and I asked one of the professors, why do you think it is that people didn't spend money after 2008? And the professor said to me, we're not really sure, but we think it's because of an exogenous shock to consumption savings preferences. So back in 2010, when I was being paid a lot of money to bet on these things, I wasn't really happy with that as an answer. So I decided to just go and ask people, why don't you spend money? If you've never done it, I would recommend doing it. You could learn a lot. So I started asking people, and, I'm from a poor background, so unlike the other traders, I knew people from poor backgrounds. I started asking them, why don't you spend more money? If you ask that, I can tell you what they're going to say. They're going to say, we don't spend any more money because we don't have any more money, right? And I wasn't happy with that as an answer. Like, I wasn't going to take their word for it, right? So I started looking into the finances of my friends and their family. And what I saw was a generation above mine. Like, back then I was in my early 20s. Our parents own property. Most of my friends will never own property. And if you're looking at a family that generation is losing their house, does it really make sense to ask why don't you spend more money? Not really. And very soon after that, I got called into a meeting by an economist at Citibank. He said, look at the financial situation of Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, but also the UK, the US, Japan. In every case, we had governments that were running their wealth down, spending more than their income, getting poorer over time. And I came out of that meeting, and I couldn't help but notice the similarity between the governments of the world and my friends from back in East London, right? In both cases, spending more than their income, losing their wealth over time, becoming wealthless, right? And I think it's really important for people here who work on building the wealth of the rich to stop and ask themselves, where's that wealth coming from? Do you think it's a coincidence that the rich get richer and richer year after year, and my friends are losing their homes, losing their wealth? That governments are losing their assets, losing their wealth? This wealth doesn't come from a vacuum. The split side of what you're doing is that my friends, their families will never own property again. Where does the wealth come from? We're losing the wealth-owning middle class. I came at that meeting and I realized what we actually have here is a structural problem of wealth being sucked out of the middle class. And that won't get better, right? Because as the middle class becomes wealthless, they pay more rent, they have to have bigger mortgages, which means they lose their wealth more quickly. What we have here is a structural problem of long-term wealth transfer from the middle class, from governments to the rich. And that doesn't get better, that gets worse over time. So I realized what this means is this crisis never gets better. So I went back to my desk, I put a big bet on that the crisis would never get better. And by the end of the year, I was the most profitable trader in the whole world at Citibank. And I think I just turned 25. So Citibank paid me a couple £1 million and said, well done, do it again. And I thought, I did do it again one more year. You know, it took me a bit of time to think it through. But then I started thinking, you know, what am I going to do with all of this money? I don't come from a rich background, you know, and, you know, I don't know how to spend millions of pounds, you know. So, and I thought, well, it's all right, I'll leave it for my kids, or I'll leave it for my kids. And then I thought, well, I'm making this money by betting on the fact that the world that my kids live in will be absolutely terrible, absolute disaster. And, you know, I don't just say this from a moral perspective. I've made millions of pounds betting on this. I'm still betting on it now. The reason I'm betting on it now is because at the beginning of COVID, it was very clear to anybody who bothered looking, which was almost nobody, with respect to Arun, not completely nobody. It was very obvious at the beginning of COVID that it would lead to a massive increase in inequality. Because the government put £600 billion into the economy to replace the spending of the rich. You know, the rich stopped spending in COVID. So it was very clear, if you bothered to look at it, that we were going to transfer £600 billion, which, by the way, would be £12,000 for every single adult in the country, from the government to the rich. It's the biggest and fastest ever increase in inequality in the history of the country. So if you are somebody who, like me, has made millions of pounds by betting on the fact that if you don't get on top of inequality, you will devastate ordinary families' living conditions, you see that happening, and you see a humanitarian disaster. So, you know, I've been screaming about this from the beginning of COVID. If you don't believe me, go and watch my YouTube channel, Gary's Economics. First video on the channel, right, where I say this is going to cause massive increase in inequality, massive increase in house prices, massive increase in asset prices, massive increase in inflation, massive collapse in living standards. Think about it, right? You cannot make the rich £600 billion richer at a time when the economy is literally closed without making ordinary families £600 billion poorer. And that is £12,000 per adult in the country. So for me, you know, I don't consider myself a great moral philosopher. I'm not Mahatma Gandhi here, right? But I'm a good trader and I'm a good economic forecaster. My bets right now are that we are not going to fix this massive increase in inequality, and this current massive decrease in living standards we're seeing is permanent and will get worse. And I'm betting on that now, and I don't want this bet to be correct for once. So I hope you guys will support me in trying to push for greater taxation of the wealthy, you know, not for moral reasons, but simply because I don't want this country to fall into abject poverty, and we're seeing it in front of our eyes. And the only way to stop that, in my opinion, is to do something about growing wealth inequality. Cool. Thank you.
Stephanie, I'm gonna. Oh, okay. I was gonna come and ask this question. How has the private client industry set the tone for wealth behaviours, and how that connects to inequality? So, Steph, I'll just come to you first, and then I'll come along.
I mean, when I look back and I reflect, I mentioned earlier, you know, I've had some space to think about my career and, you know, what was going on. And looking back, I remember kind of very early on, you know, lawyers will know that we have our client codes and matter listings and that kind of thing. And I remember, I mean, I must have been about 23 at the time, and thinking, gosh, the same people own everything. It's the same people that are selling property to each other, selling property to their family, and essentially what I experienced was this decade-long education in capital in the 21st century, and understanding how there are systems which perpetuate wealth concentration. And I think in the industry, what I realized my experience was that I didn't really understand what was on the other side of that. And Gary, you talk really eloquently about, you know, if people are winning, then there's got to be a losing side as well. And I think that we do kind of operate in a vacuum in the private wealth industry. It is a kind of, yeah, everything is exclusively about that. The assumptions that we operate on are consistently about decisions that need to be made that will protect and preserve wealth, whether that's looking at tax minimization strategies or succession planning. It's all about how do we protect and preserve, and there isn't a sort of there isn't space within the system to consider broader social, economic, and environmental kind of context. So I think that's a huge piece that's missing, kind of educationally. Before we even get to our firms, what's the kind of level of education that we're receiving? But then culturally, the way that we operate, it's these assumptions which largely go unchallenged. I think I remember the kind of handful of clients that weren't very tax driven in terms of the advice that they wanted, but by and large, these really strong assumptions that we have that we can sometimes, I remember myself, kind of imposing a kind of quite complex tax structure on someone who didn't actually really want it. And so I think there's a lot of power within the culture of the system of private wealth advice.
Jesse or Bridget, would you like to take that question in terms of how the private client industry has set the tone for wealth behaviors?
Sure. So I did an interview with one individual who said, I remember the day that tax was a front page story on the Times, because my field was suddenly a front page story, because it is esoteric, it is dry. And he said, in order for it to be a front page story, it needed to be rendered comprehensible for the general public. And in order for that to happen, it has to be made compelling, and that's done by having villains and by having heroes. Now, I think what we've heard from Gary and Arun is that it's very easy to distill from that there are villains and there are heroes. Now, setting aside the empirical accuracy, which some of you are probably saying, well, listen, I have counter arguments to what they had to say. To answer your question, Derek, what's missing in that framing is the intimacy of the relationships between the service provider and the client. That intimacy is real, it matters, and it completely renders a framing of villains and heroes irrelevant. What I mean by that is these service providers attend marriages, they attend funerals, they hold people's hand through some of the most painful moments of their life, whether that is a media crisis, whether that is a painful lawsuit. They're there for that. As Stephanie said, you celebrate with them in the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows. For those who have operating businesses, they tour the facilities, they see the manufacturing that happens, the jobs it provides, they know their philanthropy intimately. All of this in aggregate, this close-up view of what great wealth does accomplish, very convincingly lends itself to a belief that one's clients are, in fact, the heroes in this story, set upon by a world that seeks to do them harm. Right? Gary and Arun in this framing are the villains. Right? It becomes flipped. You are the ones who would seek to destroy all that they have amassed. And so the anthropological intervention here, again, is not to say, listen, this is the actual villain, this is the actual hero, right? I resist that. Instead, what I want to point out is that the biggest barrier to change is that professional service providers, in many cases, like and deeply respect and are impressed by and admire their clients. And we are here asking them to ask difficult questions of their clients and perhaps suggest that there is a much more ambiguous moral story around the wealth. And so my answer to the question is to recognize how big of a lift that is and how in many cases it's an epistemic shift in thinking, right? I don't think it's anything less than that. To say, actually, all that you admire is great, and I like it, and yet it also carries these problems, right? So anthropology asks us to hold two incompatible truths side by side as equally valid, right? The great wealth accomplishes a great deal that is good. The great wealth accomplishes a great deal that is deeply problematic.
Cool, thank you. Jesse, I want to come to you and ask, and picking up from Bridget's point, the heroes of the story, the wealthy think that they're the heroes of the story. What do you think the people in this room and others can do to change the narrative about who's the true heroes of this story?
I'll just start by picking up on something that Gary said, because like I remember sitting in science in my school, top floor, we will always look out at Canary Wharf, 15 minutes away. And the fact that we could see it 15 minutes away means that they could see us 15 minutes away. And so I think it's about, what do you do to go and understand the story? I mean, Gary mentioned that he was able to get a full picture because he knew people who were poor, who weren't spending money. And again, I think it's about asking yourselves, how do I interact with them? How do I go beyond just sitting in my office where I'm comfortable and looking at my professions? How do I engage? And I think once you get a true understanding of the people who are out there, of the things that people are going through on a daily basis, en masse in this country, I think it then becomes much more compelling in your heart to have those difficult conversations with your clients. And it then becomes a lot easier to explain what the problem is or why it needs to be fixed.
Thank you. I want to ask all the panelists very quickly, of course. What do you feel can be done to redefine the role of the trusted advisor?
Derek, you've got 10 more minutes, just so you know.
Stop. Who wants to take that first?
Oh, I'll come in, because I just have to come back on this, because it's so funny you say that, because I'm writing a book at the moment, and one of the stories I wrote was how, when I first worked at Citibank, so Citibank was the second tallest building in the country when I started working there. I think it's 46 floors or something. One of the first things I did once I felt like I was allowed to do it is go up to the top floor and go and try and see my house, right? And the top floor at the time was just for like events. So when there's no event on, it's literally just a massive floor of blue carpet. You come out the lift and all there is blue carpet. And I went to the window and I was trying to look, where's my house? And then I realized what side it was on. And when you look out that side where my house is, all you can see is the 46th floor of the HSBC building. And I think that is actually such a metaphor, right? Because these people, like, we're looking at them skyscrapers, they're looking at each other. And it's because that is, I think this is a big part of the problem, that many rich people, they don't see us, they don't know us. But they're looking at the guy who's a little bit richer than them, the guy who's one floor above them, and they have no understanding of the consequences. So I was very glad to see that you were giving the keynote speech to somebody who's experienced and is still connected to the pain that it is causing. So I think a big thing that we can do is just to try to let these people understand what I was saying, which is when you build those numbers up, where's the wealth coming from? It's not a coincidence that my community is losing their homes. It's not a coincidence the government is going into debt. The wealth comes from somewhere. So, I think there's a big part for you to just make people realize the consequences of wealth building is also it's wealth draining away from the middle class, and try to make people think, well, what does that mean for this country? Find us a country in this world that doesn't have a big, strong, property-owning middle class and has good living standards. You won't find one. So I think what I would like to do is to, as much as possible, open the eyes of the rich to what's happening in the rest of the world, in our lives.
Trusted advisor, how do we redefine it?
Thanks, Gary. For me, it always has to start with vision, and therefore, in this context, the vision for the role of private capital at this time of existential risk, where we face ecological degradation, environmental collapse, extreme inequality, which is a form of economic violence. And so really to understand what is the mandate for private capital at this time of existential risk, and what are the opportunities? And we'll be discussing that a lot more later on our panels, so I won't go into massive amounts of detail. But for me, it would be to start with that, and then the question would therefore be, how can trusted advisors galvanize around that vision and be in service, use their skills and their platforms and everything they do in service of realizing that vision. And so really, it requires a really clear vision for the role of private capital at this time and where it can be put to use in order to bring about a more just and sustainable world.
Thank you. I'm going to come to did you want to take that, Arun?
I was just going to pick up one thing that I think Steph said earlier that I thought was really interesting. It's not sitting as an academic rather than in this space. I thought it was interesting, this sort of idea of imposing, sort of, if you're an expert in something, what do you want to talk about? Right? Like, I'm an expert in something and I want to talk about it. So if you're in the space of advising and you sort of know everything about all of the tax niches and all the things that you can do, you sort of feel like, oh, but I'm so clever. I have this really good, I have this solution. I can see what you've got. I can see how I can do something for you. This must be what you want. And I think that's really interesting. That's sort of, in a sense, presumably, actually, for a lot of people, their natural imperative is like, this is a really good idea. I know I can see how it would be brilliant for something I assume you want. And I can see how eventually down the road I'm going to get industry prizes for being brilliant at finding some solution and get, the Spears profile, I'm going to get the whatever. And at some point, I think it's important to have that conversation with clients and work out what, as we did at the start of the day, what's your vision of the future? What do you want the world to look like? And then actually, are the things that we're having a conversation about, the things you think day to day, are they helping you achieve that long goal? If you want to help somebody achieve what they want, it's not just like on a day-to-day, here are the things that will help with some specific thing, but actually, where do you want to be going? And for some people, they'll say, look, my dream is I want to just have a big pile of cash, and I don't care about the rest of the world. And as long as I can build a community around me that's got gates and walls, I don't have to worry about that. And that will be someone to look out, and that's why I also think policy is important, and tax policy, wealth taxes are part of that. But the other part is actually there are a lot of people for whom I think they would be deeply uncomfortable if they understood the implications of what they're doing. Because, as was framed beautifully, there are lots of good things. Building a business is a great thing to do. You're providing something that's providing a service that people value, that people are presumably spending money on. So there's a lot of value there. But if you're not thinking about also what are the implications of the way in which I'm doing it and the way in which I'm choosing to manage that and the way in which the funding is being managed, then you're not seeing the other part of what's going on. And it's easy to just look at this bit and say, this insulates me from the fact that actually I could be paying more tax. So other things I might actually feel better about doing because it will help build that society that I want to be living in and I want my children or my grandchildren or godchildren or whoever else that you're irrationally in love with to inherit.
Sorry. We don't have to redefine it because it's already happening. The interviewees surfaced a number of reasons why. The beneficiary and trustee relationship will change and is changing dramatically. There are untold lawsuits that, if they haven't yet been filed, will be filed from beneficiaries who want to engage in ESG or impact investing or want their trustees to be doing so. The trustees are not sure if they can because it could be construed as a breach of fiduciary duty. Trustees are going to have to be a profoundly different kind of profession capable of engaging with the more aware desires of millennial and Gen Z beneficiaries. Number two, the other phrase that is uttered most consistently along with trusted advisor is, I want a long-term relationship with my clients. That long-term relationship will not be possible for a junior partner or a junior analyst if they are not incentivized to stay on in that role for the long term. The emerging research from business school land is clear. Millennials and Gen Z want their perspectives to be taken seriously at work, and we have every reason to believe that millennials and Gen Z will want their work to show care for the environment, to be climate positive, to contribute to a better society, and if they don't feel their work is doing that, they'll leave. And then you have trusted advisor firms in 20 years' time that will not be able to plausibly say we have people who have long-term relationships with clients because those presumptive staff would have left a decade ago. So there's a number of ways that the industry is already shifting in quiet corners that might seem specific to a certain discipline or field, but in aggregate will rock the field profoundly. And the other thing that I'll say is that it's neither, it is also not extraordinary to think that this field will change dramatically because it already has. For a field that sells itself as the paragon of stability, bedrock of trust, reliability, there is no resemblance between the private wealth industry of today and the private wealth industry of 25 to 30 years ago. right? Where schemes were the norm, where teetering on that border between legality and illegality was the norm and culturally fine and absolutely unremarkable, right? That is not possible today. And this is a massive change. So other massive changes are coming, right? This field is incredibly nimble and incredibly agile. And so I do believe that adaptation is really the byword, actually, among private wealth professionals.
Cool. Thanks, Bridget. Jesse.
Yeah, very briefly, what I got from across the panel is the word translators. And I'll just say in the same way, if you're presenting a new tax initiative or the new trust to your clients, in the same way you don't go into the very nuts and crooks and nuts of how it works, you sort of translate it and break it down into real terms, like what does this mean for your money, for your clients? In the same way, when you're talking about what it means in real terms, what does it mean in real terms of people?
Cool. Thank you. What does a progressive attitude to wealth look like? Where have you seen it? What does good look like?
This might be just our final question. So good thoughts.
This is our final question. Final question. And I'm going to go across every single panelist to respond to that. What's the progressive?
Sorry, what?
What's a progressive attitude to wealth look like? Where have you seen it?
I might have 30 seconds per panelist. If that's okay.
Gosh, a progressive attitude toward wealth. I want to respect the private client professional's imperative to be driven by what their clients say are their clients' values, right? That is probably not going to change, right? Professional service provider is still central to that relationship. That being said, I think that the progression, like where progressive values can be inserted into a client-led process is to ask the client, how can that scale in benefit toward doing good? Because this tends to be the missing piece, is that when a client does want to do something good, it's because it only serves their interests or their values or addresses a small problem in their way. And I think the question of scale is missing there. And this is, you know, the signature limitation of philanthropy, right? Is that it can't be scaled. It's idiosyncratic and limited to the individual, right? So scaling.
Arun?
I think a progressive attitude to wealth is one that thinks about society. And I think specifically, and just to build that out, I think a lot of people will say they think about society, and that's why they do philanthropy. But that's thinking out what they want for society, not what society wants for society. Tax is the membership fee that we all pay to be a member of the society. And if you have more wealth, you should be paying a larger membership fee. That's how it works. You know, the people who can afford to are the people who need to. But it doesn't mean you get to define, because you have more wealth, what the priorities for society should be. That is something that ultimately, if you believe in democracy, is something we should all be choosing together. And it's not okay to say, well, I don't like the current government, I don't like the current decisions that are being made, I don't like the current things, and therefore my solution is to check out from that, to not be part of that system, and choose my own system. So for me, that's what it's about.
Thanks, Arun. Jesse?
For me, the next step is think about how much is enough. Because we have people in this country who have more wealth than they will ever be able to spend. I think it's not even like the final point of what progressive is. I think just that next step is, if I have that, like, once I've reached a point where I can't spend it, how do I be more fair with how it's distributed?
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say a progressive attitude is one that understands the seriousness of the situation. We are in a country where living standards are collapsing rapidly. Tens of millions of people are worried about food and heating. That wasn't the case 5 years ago, and it's going to get worse. So for me, it's about understanding if nothing serious is done, society is looking at a collapse here. The economy is driving off a cliff, and I'm not interested in being the nicest guy in the car. You know, I want to turn that car around. So for me, a progressive approach is one that prevents this economic disaster from happening.
Thank you. Stephanie?
For me, I'm obsessed with the idea of private sufficiency and public luxury. So planning for what you need, not a penny more, and being bountiful and generous with society and the common good in mind.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, panelists. They all did 30 seconds, so a huge round of applause.